You're watching the Everything Network. Our notes state Atlantic City was incorporated in 1854 and planned as a resort city on the New Jersey coast. Tourism was the intended business from the start, with hotels and restaurants aimed at visitors arriving from inland cities. The Atlantic City Boardwalk was built in 1870 along the shoreline and became the main commercial strip. A rail line from Philadelphia to Atlantic City opened in 1878 and increased day trips and weekend travel. By 1880, the city was operating as a full resort economy with steady seasonal crowds. By the early 1900s, new hotel construction and real estate speculation expanded the Boardwalk district and the streets just inland. The resort identity also created cash businesses that were easy to skim and hard to audit. Hotel rooms, bars, restaurants, and nightlife concentrated in small areas and handled large volumes of cash. Visitors arrived for entertainment and spent money in short bursts, then returned home. Local political power became tied to who controlled permits, police response, and the flow of vice. Mob historians state this pattern existed before Prohibition and expanded sharply once alcohol was banned. By the 1920s, Atlantic City had a national reputation for lenient enforcement and tolerated vice. During Prohibition, Enoch "Nucky" Johnson, the Atlantic County Treasurer, was identified as the central political boss and the main protector of vice operations. His organization controlled policy lottery games, illegal alcohol distribution, illegal gambling, and prostitution lanes. Johnson's local power extended through elections, patronage jobs, and protection arrangements with police and officials. He also used public events and tourism promotion to keep the resort economy active while vice revenue continued. A later television series, Boardwalk Empire, used a character based loosely on Johnson, played by actor Steve Buscemi. Mafia files state Johnson's control ended in 1941 after a federal tax conviction tied to hidden proceeds from policy operations. After the Second World War, Atlantic City's tourist numbers fell and the city's older resort model weakened. Tourism shifted toward other destinations, including Florida, Cuba, the Bahamas, and Las Vegas. Older hotels became unprofitable, and many were torn down over time. The file names several that disappeared, including the Breakers and the Shelburne, along with the Mayflower, the Tremor, and the Marlborough. The Boardwalk district carried more vacancies and fewer new investments. By the 1960s, drugs and street crime increased, and the city's reputation declined in national coverage. In 1964, Atlantic City hosted the Democratic National Convention, and press attention highlighted the city's visible decline. Local officials pursued redevelopment plans and debated casino gambling as an economic fix. The political push gained momentum in the mid-1970s and selected the Boardwalk corridor as the main area for new construction. New Jersey voters approved casino gambling for Atlantic City, and state leadership planned a public announcement tied to the rollout. Mafia files state the announcement was scheduled for noon on June 2, 1977, at Kennedy Plaza near Convention Hall. The politicians seated behind the podium included Francis Hap Farley and Dr. Joseph McGann. Governor Brendan Byrne announced legalized casino gambling for Atlantic City and paired the announcement with a warning aimed at organized crime. Byrne named Angelo Bruno and Phil Testa first, then he listed Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, and Nicholas Virgilio, known as Nick the Blade. He told law enforcement to keep organized crime out of Atlantic City's casino development and told those same figures to stay away. It was a public naming of Philadelphia and Atlantic City figures. The warning did not reflect a future threat. Scarfo and Leonetti were already operating in the city at that time. Less than a mile from the announcement site, Scarfo and Leonetti watched the broadcast from their base at 28 North Georgia Avenue. Mafia files state the office was a ground-floor space used for meetings, planning, and daily coordination. Scarfo's core group in that period included Philip Leonetti, Salvatore Chucky Molino, Lawrence Molino, and Nick the Blade Virgilio. The reporting line ran upward to Phil Testa, who was Angelo Bruno's underboss. Scarfo treated Atlantic City as a controlled area and required permission for moves that created risk. He also required updates before and after jobs were completed. 2 posters were kept in the Georgia Avenue office to enforce Scarfo's procedure rule. One showed a runner touching each base on a baseball diamond. The other showed a runner missing a base and being ruled out. Scarfo used the posters to repeat a simple standard: report changes, ask permission, carry out the job, then confirm results. He treated skipped steps as violations, and he tied violations to punishment. Leonetti described Scarfo ending arguments with a short line. "It's this," followed by a hand sign of a gun. Scarfo's method relied on discipline, silence, and quick enforcement. The first major enforcement job in this file is the killing of Louis DeMarco in 1976. DeMarco was described as a hustler who cheated at illegal gambling games. The problem reached Philadelphia after DeMarco robbed craps games tied to Frank "Chicky" Narducci. Narducci was a top earner under Angelo Bruno and was treated as a made man whose games could not be hit without consequences. The Philadelphia leadership decided DeMarco would be killed. The order was sent to Scarfo with the instruction to handle it if DeMarco was hiding in Atlantic City. Scarfo assigned the DeMarco killing to Philip Leonetti and Vincent Falcone. Leonetti was 23 and described this as his first murder. The crew located DeMarco through street contacts and identified him in a coffee shop on Missouri Avenue. A local man known as Harry the Hat, identified as Skinny Razor's brother-in-law, pointed DeMarco out while DeMarco was playing cards. Leonetti and Falcone followed DeMarco from the coffee shop to the Ensign Motel on Pacific Avenue. Access at the motel was arranged through a local bartender who had a room there. Scarfo stressed masks, gloves, and clean exit procedures before the shooters moved in. The shooting was carried out at close range, and DeMarco died at the scene after multiple shots. Leonetti and Falcone left quickly and followed the disposal and separation steps Scarfo required. Scarfo picked them up after the hit and moved them away from the area. The file states Phil Testa had delayed the call to Scarfo for about a week due to his own conflict with Narducci, and Scarfo complained about the delay. Scarfo treated speed as part of discipline and treated delay as disrespect. After the killing, Narducci traveled down to Atlantic City and thanked Scarfo and the crew for completing the order. The job strengthened Scarfo's position with the Philadelphia leadership. After the DeMarco killing, Leonetti started a concrete business with his friend Vince Banchieri, and they needed equipment money. Leonetti stated the amount was about $12,000. He said Banchieri set his own house on fire and used the insurance payout to fund the company. The file uses this as an example of the crew's mix of legitimate front work and criminal work. Leonetti continued to socialize in Atlantic City nightlife while the business was starting. That led into the conflict involving bookmaker Giuseppe "Pepe" Leva. The location was the Flamingo Motel Lounge on Pacific Avenue, owned by Edwin "Eddie" Helfand. Leonetti stated Banchieri had loaned Leva $3,000 and said Leva was refusing to repay it. Leva was also making threats and telling people the money would not be returned. Leonetti confronted Leva outside the Flamingo and demanded repayment. The argument turned into a fight in the parking lot. Leonetti hit Leva hard enough to knock a tooth out. Helfand ran out and yelled, and Leonetti left with Banchieri. The dispute did not end with the fight. The next day, Helfand set a meeting with Scarfo at the Lido restaurant and told the mobster the kid wanted to press charges. Scarfo tried to calm Helfand and told him to tell Leva not to press charges. On June 28, 1977, 2 days after the fight, Leva filed a criminal complaint in Atlantic City Municipal Court, charging Leonetti with assault. Scarfo worked the situation through attorney Harold Garber and through Helfand, arranging a controlled meeting at the My Way Lounge, described as Saul Kane's place. Scarfo made Leonetti and Lever shake hands and told Lever to drop the charges, then told him to return the next day with confirmation. Lever returned, said the charges were dropped, apologized again, and shook hands with both Scarfo and Leonetti. 4 days later, on July 3, 1977, Lever was found shot to death with 4 .32 caliber slugs in his head. His body was found near a landfill in the Farmington section of Egg Harbor Township, under 10 miles from the Georgia Avenue apartment building where Scarfo and Leonetti lived. Sources state that Nicky Scarfo went to Philadelphia right after Lever filed the charges and obtained permission from Angelo Bruno and Phil Testa to kill Lever, with the stated concern that Lever could testify and expose Leonetti to jail time. The account repeats an internal rule that a murder had to be cleared with the boss or the person ordering it risked being killed. Leonetti stated he was present when Nicky Scarfo ordered the Lever hit. Mob historians describe the killing carried out by a crew member during a ride home, with Lever killed at a landfill site. Then the shooter traveled back on foot and showed injuries from moving through brush. Scarfo's reaction focused on efficiency and control, and he criticized the shooter for leaving the car behind. After Lever's death, the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office charged Philip Leonetti with the murder. Leonetti stated detectives knew he did not kill Lever due to surveillance on Leonetti the night of the murder, and he stated they tried to pin it on him anyway. Prosecutors obtained a statement from a worker tied to the trash dump, identifying Leonetti as the shooter. A couple of weeks later, the dump owner's wife contacted attorney Harold Garber and said prosecutors pressured the worker into naming Leonetti. Then he wanted to correct the story. Sources state she had been around the old Penguin Club, a strip club business Nicky Scarfo owned with Tommy Butch. Garber brought the witness to Vince Susto's insurance office and took a statement where the witness recanted. 2 detectives waited outside the office, believing Leonetti and Scarfo would try to kill the witness, and they did not know Garber was inside, taking the recantation that undermined the case. Based on that recantation, the murder charges against Philip Leonetti were dropped. Scarfo and Leonetti's reputations traveled beyond Atlantic City and Philadelphia, reaching North Jersey and New York circles where figures like Antonio Tony Bananas Caponegro and Luis Bobby Manor discussed Nicky's crew. The next escalation involves Nicholas Nick the Blade Virgilio, Scarfo's close friend and top associate. Virgilio received a 12 to 15-year sentence for a 1972 killing that occurred while Nick was incarcerated in Yardville. From custody, Nicky Scarfo used Philip Leonetti and attorney Harold Garber to arrange a $6,000 bribe to the judge in Virgilio's case for a lighter sentence. The bribe was brokered through Edwin Eddie Helfand, who functioned as a lawyer and also as a part-time municipal court judge facing an indictment for fixing cases in the Summers Point Municipal Court. Helfand owned the Flamingo Hotel, the same property tied to the Lever fight. Helfand kept the bribe money and split it with Scarfo associate Alvin Feldman, and Virgilio still received a substantial prison sentence. Mob historians describe Scarfo learning of the bribe theft while still in Yardville and treating it as an unforgivable personal violation. Sources state Scarfo believed Helfand had testified before the State Commission of Investigation and talked about Scarfo and Angelo Bruno, and he believed Helfand was also talking to the FBI. Scarfo labeled Helfand a double agent and treated him as a future homicide target. Nick also treated Alvin Feldman as a target and described Feldman as skimming money from businesses and creating risk, including street talk that Feldman planned to bomb his car. Scarfo could not immediately get approval to kill Feldman due to a debt Feldman owed to Papi Ippolito, identified as one of Angelo Bruno's top men, and Bruno required the debt to be repaid before a killing could be authorized. Scarfo stated he wanted the $60,000 himself, so he could settle it and remove Feldman immediately. Once Scarfo believed the debt was repaid, he approached Angelo Bruno in Yardville and asked permission to kill 3 people. Tommy Butch Bucci, Alvin Feldman, and Eddie Helfand. Bruno granted permission for all 3 killings. Tommy Butch Bucci ran the Penguin Club with Scarfo in the late 1960s and early 1970s on Atlantic Avenue near Virginia Avenue in Atlantic City. The file describes the Penguin Club as a strip venue used for cash hustles, overpriced bottle sales, and underworld side business, including loaning money and taking bets. When Scarfo went to jail, Bucci stopped paying off the police, and the club was shut down. Scarfo blamed Tommy for the shutdown and described it as lost income. Tommy understood Nick would want him killed and moved to South Philadelphia within weeks, working for Fonzie and Mark Marconi, men Nicky Scarfo knew. He gave Tommy a conditional pass while Tommy stayed in Philadelphia. Scarfo gave instructions that Bucci should be killed if he returned to Atlantic City. He also had a personal history with Mark Marconi, described as a former close friendship followed by a rupture and ongoing strain. Alvin Feldman did not receive the same conditional pass. Sources describes a setup led by Joseph Scalliott, tied to Santo Idone's group in northeastern Pennsylvania. Scalliott contacted Feldman and offered him work in torching a warehouse. Feldman agreed, expecting a payday, and traveled to the location. Santo Idone, Chicky Narducci, and Chicky Ciancaglini were present and confronted Feldman at the site. The account describes a struggle where Feldman tried to escape. Santo Idone was injured by mistake during the stabbing attempt, and Ciancaglini physically restrained Feldman. Chicky Narducci killed Feldman with an ice pick, and the body was disposed of in a remote location described as a sewer area in the woods. Scarfo's reaction was approving and graphic, and it reinforced the degree of violence normalized inside that circle. Our sources place Feldman's death inside Scarfo's broader effort to clear threats and settle perceived betrayals. Eddie Helfand remained alive longer due to Nicky Scarfo's decision to wait for Nick the Blade Virgilio to be released and handle the killing himself. After Scarfo returned to the street, Helfand met with the Philly mobster and presented a story blaming the judge in Virgilio's case for not honoring the bribe, and Nicky acted as though he accepted it. Helfand had his own case pressure for fixing cases and asked Scarfo and Garber to travel to Atlanta to speak with a witness and discourage testimony. Nicky Scarfo traveled with Harold Garber. The meeting occurred, and the witness did not testify, which improved Helfand's legal outlook. Back in Atlantic City, Nicky Scarfo spoke about Helfand with Chucky and Lawrence present at lunch at the Madrid restaurant. Lawrence asked why Nick would help Helfand after what he had done, and Scarfo answered with a simple statement: "I don't want him to go to jail. I want to kill him." That line defines the method described in this file. Keep the target calm, keep access open, then execute. The Helfand killing occurred on a cold February night at the Flamingo, with the Muhammad Ali-Leon Spinks fight on a closed-circuit television behind the table. Helfand sat with his wife and another couple, and the lounge was crowded and dim. Virgilio entered wearing a ski mask and carrying a handgun, and the file describes him arriving with a snow shovel used as part of his appearance and entry. Virgilio approached the table quickly and shot Helfand multiple times, including a headshot and chest shots, with Helfand dying in the room. Virgilio walked out and left the building, returning to the parking lot where the earlier Leva fight had occurred. Scarfo waited in a planned pickup position and drove Virgilio away after the killing, matching the same pattern described in earlier Atlantic City hits. The killing became front-page news due to the victim being a judge, and sources state South Philadelphia, North Jersey, and New York mob circles treated it as an announcement of Scarfo's crew's willingness to kill a public official. Mob sources includes an additional moment used to describe Virgilio's status inside Atlantic City circles during that stretch. A young bookmaker known as Bitter Beep was being cheated in card games at Harry the Hat's coffee shop, and the older players were taking his money. Virgilio entered the shop, tapped Bitter Beep on the shoulder, and told him he would play the hand. Virgilio played repeated hands without showing his cards, told the dealer to keep dealing, and collected winnings from the men who had been cheating Bitter Beep. Virgilio took several $1,000s and handed it to Bitter Beep, and the cheating stopped after that day. The point was enforcement through presence rather than a speech, and the same enforcement standard carried into Scarfo's higher-level disputes. The Atlantic City crew treated intimidation and violence as tools for profit and for status inside the wider mob network. By 1979, casino gambling was active, construction increased, and traditional mob rackets expanded alongside it, including bookmaking, loan sharking, and extortion. Scarfo's crew positioned itself to profit from the redevelopment and from vice operations tied to the casino economy. At the same time, Angelo Bruno's control in South Philadelphia began weakening after 1976. Bruno had aligned the Philadelphia family with the Gambino family in New York, and Bruno's relationship with Carlo Gambino functioned as outside support for Bruno's authority. Carlo Gambino died in 1976 at age 74 from a heart attack, and our sources state that this is when Bruno's power began to decline after that change. Bruno and Phil Testa also developed a serious internal dispute over money and how to run the family, with Bruno described as white-collar oriented and Testa described as street-oriented. The conflict created openings for figures who controlled Atlantic City and North Jersey to leverage their position. One day during that period, Angelo Bruno came down to Scarfo's Georgia Avenue office. Bruno had a home in Ventnor, and Leonetti stated he sometimes served as Bruno's driver during these trips. Bruno respected Scarfo's discipline and treated Scarfo as a figure who understood rules and enforcement, at a level many older men did not. Bruno also knew Scarfo was not someone who accepted soft talk, and Bruno approached him directly. Bruno told Scarfo he and Phil Testa were having problems and asked Scarfo whose side he was on. Bruno offered Scarfo $1,000 per week for Scarfo and the kids, and he defined the kids as Philip Leonetti, Lawrence, and Vince Falcone, each offered $500 per week. Bruno's goal was to line Scarfo's Atlantic City group against Phil Testa, remove Testa, and elevate Chicky Narducci into the underboss slot. Scarfo did not answer with agreement in that meeting. He asked Bruno what he meant by whose side, and Scarfo stated that it was all one family, he thought, using the Italian phrase una familia. Scarfo told Bruno he would think it over. Mob historians treat that moment as an early marker of how far Scarfo's influence had grown, with the Philadelphia boss traveling to Atlantic City and offering weekly money to secure Scarfo's alignment in an internal conflict, with Atlantic City money rising, a judge killing already public, and a Philadelphia leadership dispute deepening. Mob historians state that after the Atlantic County jail releases, bail conditions kept Nicodemo Scarfo, Philip Leonetti, and Lawrence Molino inside Atlantic County. He could not drive to North Jersey or New York to sit with Antonio Tony Bananas Caponegro or Louis Bobby Manna, and he could not drive to Philadelphia to handle the union dispute directly. Chucky Molino and Salvi Testa traveled down from South Philadelphia several times a week and carried what they heard on the street. They did not have access to North Jersey planning, and they did not have access to New York decision rooms. Inside Atlantic City, Scarf Inc. and Nat Nat kept running, and the defense team prepared for the Falcone trial. Harold Garber met often with him to review discovery and trial strategy. Mafia documents describe Caponegro moving in the opposite direction during the same months. He ran North Jersey, and he wanted control of the Philadelphia family. Our sources state he built early money through sports betting and loan work run out of a produce market in Newark's Down Neck area, and the nickname Tony Bananas followed him from that phase. He gathered support from men who wanted narcotics profits and men who wanted Atlantic City expanded beyond gambling, loan money, and extortion. He also pushed against Angelo Bruno's refusal to allow narcotics work, and he pushed against the boss on Atlantic City union control. At the same time, Bruno and underboss Philip "Chicken Man" Testa were in a money dispute, and the two sides were not talking directly. The consigliere kept presenting himself as loyal while preparing an internal takeover attempt. Mafia documents describe the killing on March 21, 1980, at about 10:30 at night. Angelo Bruno rode in the front passenger seat of a Chevrolet Caprice driven by John Stanfa, a young Sicilian-born associate. Raymond Long John Martorano normally drove him, and he was not available that night. Earlier, he ate with subordinates at Coos Little Italy in South Philadelphia, owned by Frank Sindone, and the location had prior ties to Piccolo's 500 Club and the Piccolo family. As the car reached the corner of 9th and Snyder near his home, the passenger window was down, and he moved to toss a cigarette into the gutter. Caponigro stepped to the passenger side with a sawed-off shotgun. He fired into the back of Bruno's head at close range. Mafia documents describe the public reaction as immediate and constant, with television carrying the scene and newspapers carrying photographs the next morning. Bruno was 69 and had led the family since the late 1950s, and reporters repeated the nickname the Docile Don while describing his style. He preferred steady rackets and low public conflict, and he opposed narcotics work for his members. The killing ended that approach in one night and created a fight over who had authority in Philadelphia, Atlantic City, and North Jersey. In the underworld, the first questions were approval and retaliation, not sympathy. In public, the focus stayed on the location, the car, and the open shot method outside a South Philadelphia home. Our sources state Philip Leonetti was at Caesars that night with Nick the Blade Virgilio. They heard the news in the lobby when Salavina was told it was on television. They walked back toward Georgia Avenue, and Virgilio reacted to a black cat crossing their path and insisted on changing routes. Leonetti went up to the apartment and told his uncle the boss had been shot outside his home. He asked to speak outside. Then they went into the office and watched live coverage. The local stations carried the breaking report and the scene outside 9th and Snyder. Lawrence Molino arrived later and said Chucky Molino reported confusion and panic in South Philadelphia. Mafia documents describe a messenger system after the killing. Bail restrictions kept the Atlantic City group in place, and subpoena risk kept Philip Testa out of New Jersey. Salvi Testa arrived early the next morning alone and met them on Georgia Avenue. He told them his father wanted them to find out who had approval and who was lying. They walked toward a small coffee shop called the Cup and Saucer and talked while moving. He answered that he would try to get information through New York contacts, and he told the messenger that the underboss should take control in Philadelphia. After the walk, he told Leonetti to call Harold Garber and bring him to Georgia Avenue. He then told the messenger to return to Philadelphia with the instruction that Philip Testa should act as boss until New York spoke. Garber arrived and was told a trip to Newark was required the next day. The lawyer said travel outside Atlantic County was forbidden, and he was ordered to find a legal path anyway. Mafia documents describe an emergency motion filed in the Falcone case, asking permission to travel to Newark to interview a criminal defense attorney for the team. The judge granted the request, and the meeting time was set for 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Newark, using a lawyer. Our sources state he wanted to sit down with Bobby Manor without using telephones. He did not want North Jersey men to know about the trip, and he did not want to use Ralph Blackie Napoli due to Ralph's position under Caponigro. Lawrence Molino called Chucky Molino and told him to come to Atlantic City immediately. When he arrived, he was sent to Greenwich Village to leave a message for Manor at a business location identified as a bakery. He did not meet Manor directly, and he returned to Atlantic City. Later that day, they ate an early dinner at Angeloni's while waiting. At that dinner, he said he believed Caponigro and Sindone were involved, and he listed possible next targets: Philip Testa, Chicky Narducci, and himself. The next day, he left early for Newark in a black Cadillac, and he went alone. The car had been staged away from the building, so he could walk to it without drawing attention. Leonetti stayed at the Georgia Avenue office and watched visitors come in and out all day. He kept the room controlled and kept the phone traffic limited. Around 4 in the afternoon, a call came in and he spoke in code. He talked about taking a short rest and asked to be woken later, and the timing pointed to a return that same evening. He then added he wanted dinner with a close friend. Chucky Merlino carried the message to Salvi Testa in Philadelphia, and a dinner was arranged with steps taken to avoid being seen arriving together. They met at Scanicchio's and sat in a back area with no one placed near them. The table included Philip Testa, Salvi Testa, Chucky Merlino, Lawrence Merlino, and Leonetti. Our sources state he opened by stating that North Jersey did it, naming Caponegro and stating Sindona was aligned with him. Testa reacted with anger and asked what would happen next. He answered that New York would sort it out, and he instructed Testa to take over as acting boss while they waited. Mafia documents describe 2 toasts at that dinner, one to the dead boss and one to what would come next. Testa also said that if New York straightened him out as the boss, the younger men would be inducted. At the same time, Caponegro held his own gathering at the 311 Club in Newark, and he spoke as if the top job would be his. Our sources state he believed he had approval after conversations with Frank Fonzi Thierry, including a line that he took as permission to do what he believed was required. Thierry did not present the request to the commission and did not secure an official sanction. New York leaders wanted Bruno removed, they wanted the Union Lane shifted, they wanted the Philadelphia Commission vote shifted, and they wanted Caponegro removed. Within days, Caponegro was called to a Greenwich Village social club used by the Genovese hierarchy. Alfred Freddy Salerno, his brother-in-law, traveled with him and waited at a nearby bar. Inside the meeting room, Vincent the Chin Gigante sat with Bobby Manna, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, and Frank Fonzi Thierry. Gigante demanded to know who gave approval for killing a boss. Caponegro blamed Thierry and said he was told the commission approved it. Thierry denied giving that instruction and said he had told him to straighten it out, not kill him. Mafia documents describe Caponegro being beaten, tortured, sexually assaulted, and killed during that session. Freddy Salerno was then lured from the bar and killed in the same operation. The death squad later reported that 2 men at a nearby bar looked like Scarfo, and Manna ordered them brought in at once. The men were John Stanfer and Frank Sindoni, and they left before the pickup. The bodies of Caponegro and Freddy Salerno were later found in the trunk of a car in the South Bronx. $5 bills were placed in their mouths and in their bodies as a message about greed. The next day, Blackie Napoli traveled down to Atlantic City and delivered the news that Caponegro and Freddy Salerno were dead. He also stated he provided the shotgun used in the Bruno killing. He told them Manna wanted Philip Testa and Scarfo in New York the next day. Bail restrictions still applied, so a plan was made for him to leave through back alleys and meet the Philadelphia car a few blocks away. Leonetti was told to keep the Cadillac visible in front of the office and stay outside all day to draw surveillance attention. The building backed into alleys and terraces that allowed several blocks of movement without being seen. The next morning, he slipped out while Leonetti remained in place. Mafia documents describe the New York sit-down where the commission recognized Philip Testa as the new boss. The order required him to name Scarfo as underboss or consigliere, and the choice was consigliere. The same directive required that everyone involved in Bruno's death be identified and killed. It also ordered Blackie to remain in control of North Jersey. After the sit-down, Testa held a meeting in the back room at Virgilio's restaurant in Old City. Captains in attendance included Santo Idone, Joe Scafidi, Alfred Iezzi, John Gianni Capello, and Chicky Narducci, and Napoli also attended. Bobby Manna attended to confirm the Genovese relationship and confirm the decision. Testa announced Pete Casella as underboss and Scarfo as consigliere. Our sources state the consigliere expected the underboss slot and was angry about Casella. Casella had drug history, and that choice created confusion inside the group. The rule was simple. The boss made the call, and the call stood. Soon after, Testa sent word that the younger men would be inducted, including Leonetti, Chucky Molino, Salvi Testa, and Lawrence Molino. The reason given was the risk of prison time hanging over the Atlantic City case, and he wanted them to enter custody as made members if convictions hit. That message ended the first phase after Bruno's death and set the next phase of internal enforcement and recognition. Mob historians state the Falcone murder arrest put Nicodemo Scarfo, Philip Leonetti, and Lawrence Molino into a case that had one clear outcome for them: win or go away for a long time. He started working on defense strategy immediately after the arrest and treated the courtroom as the main problem in front of him. The first step was building a legal team with defined roles. Harold Garber represented him, Edwin Jacobs represented Leonetti, and Lawrence retained Bobby Simone, fence lawyer from Philadelphia, who had already handled many organized crime cases. Jury selection was set for early September 1980. During the trial weeks, Leonetti stayed at the Claridge Hotel and Casino and kept his routine narrow. Mafia documents describe New Jersey bringing the Falcone murder case in Atlantic County, with proceedings held at the courthouse in Mays Landing, about 15 miles from Atlantic City. The prosecutor was Jeffrey Blitz, and the judge was William Miller, brought in from another county to handle the trial. A motion was granted that allowed live television coverage of the proceedings each day, which placed the case in front of the local audience daily. On the first morning, they arrived in his Cadillac. Ed Harrell drove, working as a private investigator for Bobby Simone, and Simone sat in the front seat. Harrell was described as a gentleman, and was also described as having worked with Martin Luther King Jr. during the 1960s. Reporters and cameras were already outside the courthouse entrance as the car pulled up. Scarfo looked out at the crowd and asked if the cameras were there for them, then heard Simone confirm it. Harold dropped the group at the front, and they walked through the press line into the building. Simone answered questions with short refusals and kept moving. Inside, they met Garber and Jacobs and prepared for opening statements. Garber went first and kept it brief, stating his name, stating he represented Scarfo, stating the evidence would show his client was not guilty, then sitting down. Our notes state Scarfo reacted with anger to that short opening and treated it as disrespectful to the situation. The state's main witness was Joe Salerno, and the defense focus stayed on his credibility from the start. Salerno and his family were moved out of Brigantine, then relocated under the Witness Protection Program to Topeka, Kansas, with new identities. When he returned to testify, he wore a protective vest and was guarded by U.S. Marshals carrying long guns. He took the stand within 10 feet of the defendants and avoided looking toward them during his testimony. The prosecutor had him explain how he met the Atlantic City crew, how Leonetti loaned him money, and how he supplied guns, then had him describe the Margate night where Falcone was killed. The defense strategy stayed fixed: make the jury doubt him, and the case collapses. During the trial days, the defense team met at night and kept the talk limited to tactics. They went to Caesars for dinner after court sessions, and the group included Leonetti, Scarfo, Lawrence, Garber, Simone, Jacobs, and at least one more man from the circle. The focus stayed on how to attack Salerno's story and how to show the jury he had incentives to say what the state wanted. At the same time, another issue reached Scarfo from Philadelphia and Trenton lanes. Johnny Keys Simone was described as a made member from the Bruno family who operated around Trenton and had ties to the Gambino family. Mafia documents describe him as a distant cousin of Angelo Bruno, who used a Trenton-based Gambino capo, Nicholas "Nicky" Russo, to pass messages upward to Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Our notes State Russo had been part of the Yardville Nine with Bruno and Scarfo in the early 1970s, and the Trenton link gave Johnny Keys an access route into New York. Johnny Keys explored a move against Philadelphia boss Phil Tester with the goal of taking the top position for himself, following a pattern similar to earlier attempts tied to Tony Caponegro. Scarfo received word that the plot talk was moving through Gambino channels. He reported it to Bobby Manna in New York and asked him to check it. A short time later, Manna sent word that he was dispatching a Gambino soldier, Sammy Gravano, to speak with them directly. Manna described him as a reliable La Cosa Nostra man and said he was respected in New York. The first meeting with Gravano took place at Bally's Park Place in the lobby lounge, followed by dinner at Angelo's. The dinner included Scarfo, Leonetti, and Gravano. Gravano spoke in direct terms and said he did not care about Johnny Keys personally, and he said that if Keys was making a move against the Philadelphia family, then the Gambino side would handle him. He said he had approval from Castellano to kill Keys for plotting against the boss. Scarfo liked the direct approach and treated the visit as a serious signal from New York. They spoke for hours about La Cosa Nostra structure and rules. A short time later, Johnny Keys Simone was found dead in a Staten Island landfill, shot multiple times in the back of the head after being taken from a country club parking lot outside Trenton. With Johnny Keys removed, the defense focus returned to the Falcone trial, which was being broadcast live each day. Our notes state the broadcast drew strong local attention and produced high ratings. Joe Salerno stayed on the stand and described the killing in detail, including the gun use and the sequence of actions inside the Margate apartment. Leonetti described his internal reaction as fear and resignation during that testimony. Cross-examination became the turning point the defense needed. Garber and Jacobs pressed Salerno, then Bobby Simone attacked him aggressively and made him look unreliable to the jury, even while Salerno stayed consistent in his story. After the state rested, the defendants and lawyers met in a small courthouse conference room to discuss next steps. Simone said he believed he could win a dismissal motion for Lawrence on the grounds that Lawrence did not pull the trigger and did not order the murder. A successful motion would remove Lawrence from the case before closing arguments. Scarfo and Leonetti wanted Simone to stay in the case for closing, since they believed he had performed best in front of the jury. Scarfo asked the lawyers to step outside briefly so he could talk privately with Leonetti and Lawrence. He asked Lawrence what he wanted to do, and Lawrence asked Leonetti for his view. Our sources state Lawrence chose loyalty and said he wanted the same outcome as the other two. Closing arguments followed, and the defense believed the jury had heard what it needed. After closings, Garber disclosed he knew one juror, a liquor salesman, and believed that juror would not vote to convict, which suggested a hung jury at minimum. Scarfo reacted with anger that he was told this only at that late point. A short time later, the court announced the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. Scarfo, Leonetti, and Lawrence spoke briefly in private and then entered the packed courtroom with reporters, detectives, and sheriff's officers filling seats and aisles. The judge read verdicts in sequence: not guilty for Lawrence, not guilty for Scarfo, then not guilty for Leonetti. Mafia documents describe them shaking hands with counsel and walking out, while prosecutors and detectives reacted openly. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked Scarfo for comment, and he looked into the television camera and gave a short statement praising the jury system and the jury. Leonetti was visible behind him on the broadcast and was described as smiling. That night, a celebration was held on Georgia Avenue in Atlantic City. Our sources state the party included the lawyers and their families, and included crew figures such as Chucky Merlino and Nick the Blade Virgilio, plus Saul Kane, Vince Susto, Salvi, and neighborhood associates who had been around the Atlantic City group. During the night, he pulled Leonetti and Lawrence aside and said they had beaten a murder case and needed to be more careful going forward. Within weeks, he returned to enforcement work and approved another killing. Frank the Barracuda Sindone was identified as a man tied to the plot that killed Angelo Bruno, and Scarfo had long hostility toward him. He told Phil Testa that Sindone could not be trusted, and Testa agreed with that assessment. A setup was arranged in South Philadelphia. Salvi Testa brought Sindone to a house where Frank Monte was present. When Sindone was in position and greeting Monte, Chucky Molino fired from behind and hit him multiple times in the head. The body was left behind a South Philadelphia store in an alley. Phil Testa sent word that Sindone's rackets would be divided among Salvi Testa, Chucky Molino, and Frank Monte, with Joseph Chicky Ciancaglini also receiving a piece and supervising what remained. Attention then shifted to the unions tied to Atlantic City. John McCullough ran the Roofers Union in Philadelphia and was described as closely connected to Angelo Bruno during Bruno's reign. Bruno had pushed McCullough as a choice to influence Atlantic City union lanes instead of Scarfo's group. Our notes state Scarfo disliked McCullough and treated him as a direct obstacle to money and control. With Bruno dead, he viewed McCullough as exposed and pushed Phil Testa for permission to have him killed. Testa approved the hit, and the reason stated inside the circle was interference in Local 54 and losses tied to that interference. He used Raymond Long John Martirano, a made member with access to McCullough, and ordered him to assist with the killing. He also directed Martirano to involve Al Didon, a man tied to the Camden Bartenders Union associated with Ralph Natal. He offered Didon a Local 54 business agent position if he helped, and he threatened to kill him if he refused. The hit took place on Tuesday, December 16, 1980, in the Bustleton section of North Philadelphia, outside McCullough's home. A delivery van arrived, and a man carried poinsettias to the door. Mrs. McCullough let him inside, and he set 2 plants on the table in the kitchen, while McCullough stood nearby using a wall phone. The delivery man said he had another plant in the truck, and stepped out, and McCullough told his wife to tip him $3 instead of 2. When the delivery man returned with the 3rd plant, he placed it on the table, pulled a .22 handgun, and fired 6 shots into McCullough's head and neck at close range. McCullough fell and died on the floor while his wife screamed. The gunman left the house calmly, returned to the van, and drove away. Mafia documents describe the killing becoming the lead news story that night, and removing McCullough as a union obstacle in the Atlantic City lane. Scarfo was pleased at first, then learned Martirano had not done the shooting himself, and had used a civilian named Willard Moran to carry it out. He reacted with anger toward Martirano for outsourcing the act to a non-member. Al Didon later denied involvement, and Martirano remained in position after Phil Testa calmed Scarfo down. Our sources state Testa warned him that constant internal killing would leave the family with no one left to use. Mafia documents list the murders tied to the 1980 power struggle and the same period: Angelo Bruno, Tony Caponigro, Freddie Salerno, Johnny Keys Simone, Frank Sindone, and John McCullough. The year ended with the organization carrying multiple dead leaders and multiple new enemies. Early in 1981, the next federal move became known inside the Atlantic City Circle. Federal prosecutors in Camden prepared a felon in possession indictment tied to a small .22 found in his bedroom drawer during the Falcone arrest search. Our sources state he expected prison time on that gun case and began shifting more Atlantic City responsibility to Leonetti. Leonetti expanded union work and described the circle as controlling the unions in the city. He also opened a lane to local political figures, including a man named Mike Matthews, who wanted to become mayor of Atlantic City. Our notes state Leonetti sent word that they would meet at the right time and discuss election support. He also said the circle helped make Joe Pasquale chief of police in Atlantic City. Mafia documents describe their union leverage as strong enough to shut down casino work through a citywide strike initiated by a single phone call. The same sources describe a second leverage method, threats of violence used to force compliance. A specific contract dispute is described in the record. Leonetti learned that a casino president was refusing to sign the Local 54 union contract. He sent word to that executive with a direct threat that he would kill him if the contract was not signed. The contract was signed the next day. Scarfo reduced his own public movement while anticipating the gun case, and Leonetti handled day-to-day operations in Atlantic City during that stretch. Chicky Narducci returned to plotting behavior, this time working toward a move against Phil Testa through underboss Pete Casella. Narducci offered Casella $1 million to retire to Florida after Testa was killed, in exchange for Casella naming Narducci as boss. Mafia documents describe Casella as broke and eager for the offer, and the two men began a plot to remove Testa. Scarfo and Leonetti were in Atlantic City for most of that stretch and were not traveling to Philadelphia constantly, so their direct visibility into the plot was limited. Leonetti described exhaustion after years of constant closeness to his uncle, daily travel, meetings, planning, and multiple murder charges, including the Falcone case they had just won. Scarfo had promised him and Lawrence a Florida trip if they beat the Falcone case, and the trip was treated as relief after months of trial pressure. Soon after the verdict, he told them to go south for a few days. They flew to Miami and stayed in a suite at the Diplomat Hotel in Hollywood, Florida, then spent days at the pool and nights at restaurants. When they returned to Philadelphia, Chucky Merlino met them at the airport with a message that Phil Testa needed to see Scarfo immediately. They went to Testa's place on Bank Street in the Old City area and met in a back booth. Testa was there with Frank Monte and Salvi Testa. Scarfo arrived with Leonetti, Chucky, and Lawrence and sat with them. Testa said he believed Chicky Narducci was making a move against him and said Street Talk supported that view. He also said Narducci had recently asked to borrow $50,000, and Testa treated that request as a sign of a setup since Narducci was already wealthy. Scarfo responded with a direct decision and said Narducci had to be killed before he killed Testa, and Testa showed visible relief. Scarfo said they would go back the next day and work out the move, then returned to Atlantic City. The plan did not happen, and the event that followed changed the entire structure overnight. After 3 a.m, Phil Testa returned to his home on Porter Street in the 2100 block in the Girard Estates area of South Philadelphia after collection work. He parked and walked up to his porch and reached for the front door. A black Volkswagen van was parked across the street, and Rocco Marinucci was inside, identified as Pete Casella's driver and a young associate. A homemade bomb was placed under the porch, built with nails and 13 sticks of dynamite, and connected to a handheld detonator. Marinucci triggered the detonator as Testa reached the door area, and the explosion killed him. Police, fire, and ambulance units arrived, and the scene was treated as a major organized crime killing. And FBI organized crime agents were also present early. Neighbors gathered, and the press arrived soon after, and the victim was taken to St. Agnes Hospital on Broad Street, where he died from the injuries. Mafia documents describe public reaction that morning as shock mixed with routine acceptance in some quarters, while underworld reaction treated the murder as a major political killing. It was the second boss-level death connected to the Philadelphia Atlantic City family in less than a year, following the March 21, 1980 killing of Angelo Bruno. The event became widely known beyond Philadelphia, and later popular culture references followed, including a Bruce Springsteen song. Our sources state the internal rule was clear: a sitting boss being killed triggers retaliation and a fight over control. At around 3:30 or 3:45 that morning, Salvi Testa called Leonetti and said his father had been killed. Leonetti asked what happened and heard the details about a bomb at the house and the death. Salvi spoke with grief and anger and said he would kill the people responsible once he learned who they were. Leonetti told him to rest and said he and Scarfo would come up within hours to help determine what happened. Leonetti went next door to Scarfo's apartment and woke him. Scarfo asked what happened and then went to the kitchen while his wife made coffee. The two men sat with little talk, and Scarfo asked Leonetti if he understood what the bombing meant. Leonetti understood that either the group that killed Testa would try to remove Scarfo and the Atlantic City crew, or Scarfo's side would remove them and take control. Scarfo stayed quiet and looked ahead while thinking through names and positions. After a short time, he said he would go back to sleep for a few hours and told Leonetti to pick him up around 10 in the morning for the drive to Philadelphia. Leonetti could not sleep after that and stayed awake thinking through prior murders, prior betrayals, and the fact that the stakes increased with a boss bombing. In the morning, he prepared the car and arrived on schedule. Scarfo dressed in a suit and tie and appeared ready to move quickly. He told Leonetti to pick up Lawrence and to collect Chucky, then go to Salvi and his family, and then work out who was behind the bombing. Leonetti asked about carrying guns on the drive, using the short hand signal he and Scarfo used, and he said weapons could be obtained in Philadelphia if needed. He was on bail on the gun possession case and expected police attention on the trip. The drive from Atlantic City to South Philadelphia ran about 60 miles on the Atlantic City Expressway and over the Walt Whitman Bridge, and the group treated the route as a risk for a stop and search. They drove in silence for long stretches due to concern about listening devices. In Philadelphia, they stopped at Chucky Merlino's house near 9th and Jackson and spoke outside. Chucky relayed street talk and said the bomb was being described as a nail bomb and that the Irish and the Roofers Union were being blamed as payback for the McCullough killing. Scarfo rejected the Irish explanation and stated that an Irish group would not take out a La Cosa Nostra boss in that way. He listed lanes he did not believe were responsible: New York, North Jersey, the Irish, and the Atlantic City crew itself. He said that left South Philadelphia as the likely origin. He referenced Testa's meeting hours earlier about his conflict with Chicky Narducci and said Narducci was a likely suspect. Leonetti added that Salvi would kill Narducci immediately if he believed it, including at the funeral. Scarfo told Chucky, Lawrence, and Leonetti to play dumb and to watch who lined up with whom. He said Salvi needed to be kept calm while they gathered information. They drove to the house where Salvi Testa was with his sister, other relatives, and older figures from the prior regime. They paid respects and spoke with the family. Salvi spoke in direct terms and said he intended to kill the people responsible himself. Scarfo put his hand on Salvi's shoulder, looked him in the eye, and said the group would find out who did it. He used the short phrase he used when he wanted certainty and made the gun hand sign to indicate the outcome he intended. He also told Salvi to wait and to avoid acting too fast. Salvi nodded and accepted the instruction for the moment. Mob historians state the hours after Philip Testa's bombing were treated as a security period, not a mourning period. Visitors arrived fast and the room filled with made men, associates and hangers-on, and the movement created risk. Joey Pungatore and Gino Milano stayed near Salvi Testa and watched who approached him. Frank Chicky Narducci arrived with his sons, Frank Jr. and Philip, and presented himself as a loyal friend of the dead boss. He repeated the Irish story in front of multiple people and tried to steer anger toward an outside target. He was told to wait, and he was told New York would decide the next steps. Mafia documents describe 3 names circulating in the first days as possible successors. Pete Casella was the underboss selected by Testa, and his title gave him a claim. Harry Riccobini was a soldier with a Southwest Philadelphia crew and his own money lanes. Nicodemo Scarfo was the consigliere and the point of contact you, New York would speak to directly. Our sources state Riccobene and Casella both carried drug reputations, and that drug lane created friction with Scarfo's strict position. The commission rules stayed in place. The final decision would come from New York. Mob historians state Riccobene's name carried weight in southwest Philadelphia and also carried baggage. He was described as very small, with a hunched back, and he led a crew that controlled gambling, loan money, and extortion in that area. Mafia documents describe a drug-dealing reputation attached to his group, and that reputation created constant conflict with the anti-drug rule enforced by Scarfo's side. He was also described as disrespectful in meetings and careless with hierarchy. The older rules required deference and controlled talk, and he did not follow that standard. That combination made him a problem candidate, even before New York weighed in. Our sources state New York's interest in Philadelphia grew after Angelo Bruno's death and after a commission shift that increased Genovese's influence. Vincent, the Chin Gigante, was treated as the key decision-maker for this transition, with Bobby Manna and Anthony Fat Tony Salerno sitting beside him in the decision lane. After Bruno was killed, he wanted Scarfo elevated, and the answer from Atlantic City was no. Phil Testa was supported for the top job. New York then ordered that Testa place Scarfo in a senior position under him, and he became consigliere. Testa's underboss pick was Casella, and the choice put a drug figure into the second slot. That selection stayed in place until the bombing and the sit-downs that followed. Our sources state the working base during the wake stretch was the 9M bar at 9th and Miami, a corner location used for controlled meetings. He stayed there with Chucky Molino and Lawrence Molino and treated it as a place to receive updates. The captain roster at the time included Alfred Freddie Ezzi, Santo Idone, Joseph Scafidi, Frank Monte, John Capello, and Chicky Narducci. The support lines were tracked in plain numbers. 4 of 6 captains leaned toward Scarfo, 2 leaned toward Casella. No captain backed Riccobene at that stage. The imbalance pushed the other side to attempt to sit down. Chicky Narducci approached and said Casella wanted a meeting after the wake at John Capello's house. Capello was Casella's brother-in-law, and the house was treated as safe ground for that faction. The answer given was yes, and the acceptance came with conditions. Philip Leonetti told him Capello would sit at the 9M bar as insurance while the meeting happened. He said Capello would be killed if anyone other than his uncle and Chucky returned through the door. The warning was delivered face-to-face, and then the conversation ended. After that exchange, our sources state Blackie Napoli was ordered to leave the wake and drive north to arrange a sit-down with Louis Bobby Manna. He was told to return with the message, no matter the hour. Chucky Molino was sent out to secure guns for Leonetti and Lawrence, and extra men were placed in and around the 9M bar. Capello arrived later and was frisked for weapons at the door. He complained about the precaution and was told it was required. The bar stayed staffed with armed men, and the front door was watched. Capello tried to make conversation and returned to the Irish story, and he kept talking while Leonetti and Lawrence stayed quiet. He was told directly that he would not leave alive if anything happened to the men at the meeting. After that, he spoke less and drank more. The waiting stretched across hours, and the men watching the door shifted positions and checked the street. Card players stood up when the door opened, and the men at the entrance moved off their stools when footsteps approached. When the uncle and Chucky returned, the gun was put away, and Capello was told he could leave. At Capello's house, the other side assembled Casella, his brother Anthony, Rocco Marinucci, John Grande with his son, and Chicky Narducci. Our sources state they checked for weapons at the door and kept a police scanner running inside. Rocco stood near a window and monitored the scanner, and a rug in the room was rolled up. The meeting opened with Casella repeating the Irish story and pressing for retaliation while speaking with the tone of authority. Scarfo said he did not accept that story and said he had a New York meeting scheduled for the next day. The room went quiet, and the meeting ended quickly after that. Back at the 9M bar, only the inner group stayed in the room to hear what happened, and the rest were kept outside. The report was blunt. The other side was prepared for violence, and the insurance plan blocked it. Blackie Napoli returned around 2 in the morning with the New York message. The instruction was to come up the next day for a sit-down, and it required leaving the funeral schedule. He decided to go anyway, and the choice was treated as priority over the funeral. They drove back to Atlantic City near dawn, with men walking them to the car and watching the street behind them. Dutch was used as a support man in Atlantic City, and our sources state he lived in the building and ran errands. He received free housing and about $200 per week, and did odd jobs tied to Scarf Inc. and Nat Nat. He also helped the grandmother and mother with small tasks and stayed away from criminal work. A clean car was staged for the next morning and parked off Florida Avenue. The goal was leaving by back alleys and avoiding a tail. The plan required speed and silence at first light. On the morning of the funeral, Lawrence and Leonetti prepared to go to Philadelphia, while the uncle prepared to go north. He told them to watch who gathered with whom, and to report it later. Blackie Napoli was picked up, and they drove toward Hoboken for the sit-down with Bobby Manor. Mafia documents describe the meeting as a detailed report of events: the bombing, the wake pressure, the Irish talk, and the Capello House meeting. Bobby Manor said the commission viewed the bombing as unsanctioned and said an investigation would follow. He said a second sit-down would be scheduled and both men would appear and give their version to Genovese leadership. The return trip ended with dinner at Caesar's, with a short instruction to stay close to home for the week. Our sources state Atlantic City filled with visitors in the days before the New York sit-down, and most came to gain standing with the expected next boss. Leonetti and Lawrence handled the visits in the office, while the uncle stayed upstairs and limited contact. The meeting day arrived with a 1 o'clock schedule in New York. A car switch plan was used on the Garden State Parkway, using ramps running opposite directions, and the Cadillac was sent south while the meeting car went north. The switch removed the tail line and provided a clean drive into the city. The drive time was used for short planning talk and rules review. The protocol in New York started with a Little Italy restaurant where Benny Eggs Mangano greeted them and treated Leonetti with respect. Food and drinks were set quickly, and the group waited for Casella to arrive. The wait ran long, and the table stayed under observation from Genovese men moving in and out. Mafia documents describe Casella having a separate Genovese connection from past time in custody, and that connection was used to argue his case in the other room. The wait continued into mid-afternoon, and no one at the table challenged the delay or asked questions. Around 4, Casella arrived with Rocco Marinucci and introduced him as a friend. Rocco was ordered out to the car, and Benny Mangano refused to shake his hand. A messenger returned and said the leaders were ready. Benny stayed behind with Leonetti and kept him at the restaurant while the two candidates were escorted away. Mafia documents describe the destination as the Triangle Social Club on Sullivan Street. The windows were blacked out and 2 chairs were set facing a table. Vincent, the Chin, sat at the center with Bobby Manor on one side and Anthony Fat Tony Salerno on the other. Our sources state the questioning started with Casella and the demand for names. He admitted he was part of the plot, and he named Chicky Narducci and Rocco Marinucci, and he also named an additional young participant connected to Rocco. He could not provide the additional name, and he lowered his head after that. Gigante ordered him to retire to Florida immediately and banned him from returning to Philadelphia. He was warned to keep the meeting quiet and was threatened with death for himself and close relatives if he spoke. A Genovese soldier escorted him out. With Casella gone, the decision for the Philadelphia slot was delivered in one sentence. He was told there was no other candidate in the room and the job was his. He greeted the three Genovese leaders in the customary way and then left with the outcome settled. Mafia documents describe the return to Atlantic City as fast and direct. A small group was waiting at Georgia Avenue, including Chucky Molino, Lawrence Molino, Salvi Testa, and Frank Monte. Leonetti introduced his uncle as the new boss, and the group celebrated briefly at Angeloni's.